Hi, everybody, and welcome to another session of Ask the Expert. I'm Jesse Schulman. I'm a senior developer with ServiceNow. I'm based out of the San Diego office, and I'm the developer lead for the orchestration team. I've done one other Ask the Expert, so thank you for coming back to learn more about orchestration. I've been with the company about 5.5 years, and I've had roles with our internal operations team, building all the automations that we have for cloning and provisioning and high availability and things like that. And I also spent some time in a services role where I helped customers implement discovery and orchestration. And now been about 1.5 years in the product development role, helping build orchestration. So today, what we're going to talk about is one of the features we added in Fuji, and that is the activity designer, as well as we'll touch a little bit on the databus. So these two new features are for orchestration customers to be able to build custom orchestration activities that are reusable and can be shared in our new app store. Today we're going to focus on PowerShell. We're going to see how to build a custom PowerShell activity, and we're going to see some of the tips that are good tips to have for building PowerShell scripts. And we're also going to see how to use that activity inside of a workflow to wire up the inputs and outputs from the databus. So a couple things. One is that the workflow, I've already got a workflow built, and it's using REST. The APIs we're going to interact with are from Spotify. I picked those because it's music. Everybody's familiar with music, and because they're free APIs that don't require authentication, so they're simple to use for a demo. We do have one activity already built that will turn an artist's name into the artist ID in the Spotify system. And then we're going to actually use PowerShell to call a couple other APIs. And the real reason we're doing that is because the API from Spotify can give us XML and it can give us JSON. That's going to show us some of the tools that we have in the activity designer. Typically, you would probably use REST-based activities for all three of these actions. But for this demo, to show examples of consuming JSON and XML inside the activity designer, what we're going to do is use PowerShell to call those APIs. I am using PowerShell 3, so some of the modules that I'm using may not be available in PowerShell 2. So I'm using the invoke REST command and also the convert to JSON command. So if those aren't available in your system, then it's because you need to get upgraded to PowerShell 3, which is default in Windows 2012, but in 2008 R2, you won't necessarily have that available. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. All right. So the activity designer is now part of the workflow IDE. So to get to that, we would hit editor in the filter text on the left, open up the workflow editor. And you'll see here in Fuji that we've added a few new things. We've added a set of tabs here on the right inside what we call the palette. And we also have a couple of things here. Here we have some links directly to the community for both workflow and orchestration. So you can see some videos that might be helpful. You can see community posts, and you can also get a link to the live feed inside of your instance if there's live feed being used for orchestration within your organization. We also have similar for workflow, the same kind of interface. So we added the tabs. So what we're first going to do is I'm going to open up the workflow that I've already built. I have a workflow here called Ask the Expert. When I click on it, now opens up in a tab here. You can see I have one activity to get the artist ID, and I have a log message to log the top tracks. What's missing is the activity here in the middle that we're going to build today, and we're going to wire into this workflow. This workflow ultimately is going to, given an artist name as an input to the workflow, we're going to turn that artist name into a list of the top tracks, the top 10 tracks, most popular tracks for that artist in the Spotify system. And that's what we're just going to log here. So it's a simple example, but it'll show some important things to know about the activity designer. We'll touch on some of the features. You'll get to see the databus and also some things about PowerShell that are really handy to know. So the other tabs here I'll explain. Core, this is the activities that you're probably all very familiar with. We have added search features, so if we wanted to say like the if activity, you can see now it'll just filter them down. So although they are separated by categories, you can also search for them. Packs, this is intended for activity packs that can come from the App Store. So these new custom activities can go to the App Store. And so as those start showing up, they'll show up here in the Packs tab. The Custom tab, this is a list of all the custom activities that have been built in your system. So any activities that you build using the new activity designer will show up here in categories if you set them, also organized by scope, according to the new app scoping that was also introduced in Fuji. And lastly, the Data tab. This is the databus that we have referred to, and it's allowing you drag and drop access to the data that's relevant to this workflow. So all these tabs here on the right, they have different behaviors, and they will change as you change the tabs here in the workflow canvas over here on the left. So this data tab right here is contextual to this workflow. I already have one workflow input called artist name. So when I run this workflow, it will prompt me for the name of the artist that I want to get the top tracks for. And it also has one activity output here because the get artist ID is an activity that was built with the activity designer. So as you'll see in a moment, you define the outputs and inputs of that activity, and we can see the output of that activity here available to the rest of the workflow. So that's the concept of the data bus, that you have access to the data that we know exists in your workflow, and then you can drag and drop these values into the activities as you need. So you can drive the inputs of a later activity from the outputs of previous activities. And it doesn't have to be the activity immediately preceding the activity you're working on. It can actually be any activity in the workflow that you can consume the outputs of. So we need to create a custom activity. Like I said in this example, we're going to use PowerShell. We're going to use the PowerShell invoke REST command, or invoke REST, to call a couple of Spotify APIs that are free. Typically, like I said, you'd use a REST activity for that, but for this example, we'll be creating a new activity in PowerShell. So to create a new activity, you would click the plus to create a new activity, and it'll prompt you to select which template you want to use. So these are all the templates. They're similar to the base activities that we had in the older orchestration activities. So you can do SSH, PowerShell, REST, SOAP, and there's a few others. The one we're doing today is PowerShell, so I'll click that, and you'll see the activity designer opens up in a new tab. So this activity is to get top tracks for artist. So this is essentially creating a new activity definition. If you're familiar with the way things used to be described before Fuji, this is comparable to an activity definition, but it's a whole new interface for building those activities. Anybody who's familiar with creating an activity definition before Fuji knows there's a lot of scripting involved. You had to know a lot of specific variables that were only relevant to building a custom activity, and we've tried to take away that complication to make it really easy to build a custom activity here. So you define inputs and outputs. The inputs that you define here, these are the inputs that will be collected from the workflow author when you drop this activity into the workflow canvas. Unlike prior to Fuji activities, you also define the outputs of your activity. So these are where you can say this activity's outputs will be these properties or these variables. It's a clean interface, so you can have an input and an output for your activity that's defined, and it's a contract to the workflow. The workflow author, this is what you need to give me, and this is what you'll give back. Now, on the right-hand side of this Inputs tab, you'll see inputs that are specific to this execution template, PowerShell. if you've used the PowerShell activity before Fuji, these should be fairly familiar. We need to know the host. If you want to run a script file or just a custom command, we have a nicer interface for providing the PowerShell variables. This used to just be a JSON string that you had to type yourself, but now you can give name-value pairs. You can also say the type. And we also have a credential tag, and you can add capabilities. If this activity needs something more specific than just PowerShell, you can add other capabilities, like if you had to create some custom ones like Exchange or other things specific to what this PowerShell activity is going to do. So, as an input for this activity, to get the top tracks for an artist, we need the artist ID. So I'm going to type the name of my input. And if you separate by underscores, or if you put a capital letter, when we generate the label, that will become a new word. So artist ID here will actually become artist space ID when it's prompting in the workflow canvas. And this is just a simple string, and that's the only input this workflow needs. Now for the target host, I don't really have any specific host that I'm going against. I'm just going to use the mid server's local host to execute PowerShell to talk to the Spotify APIs. So here I'm just going to use localhost for this example. Now for the command, I will be honest, I did work on this yesterday, so I have the command already put together. So let me go through what I'm doing here. I'm creating a variable called artist.xml, and it's the result of calling the invoke rest method PowerShell commandlet, and then the URL that I'm calling that against is there. Now you'll notice artist ID here. This is actually where the artist ID needs to go to generate the correct URL. And then top tracks JSON, I'm calling a different REST API from Spotify. And again, the artist ID needs to go here. Now, this variable in PowerShell will end up being JSON, and this variable will end up being XML. The reason I'm doing this is so that I can show you both how to parse JSON as well as how to parse XML. Now, another concept that I'm sharing here is a concept that applies to both SSH and PowerShell, and it's something that we have had before Fuji. So if you're still on Eureka or earlier versions, you can still leverage this. And it's that we have a parsing that goes on. So when we run the PowerShell command and we collect its output, we do some processing before we provide the output back to you. In legacy activities, we do this before we run the sensor script. And here in the new activity designer, we do this processing before we provide you with the execution results. Before we run your post-processing, before we populate your outputs, we parse the output from the PowerShell command to look for what we call tags. And tags is really just a pattern of 2% signs and the name of a tag or a variable, and then 2% signs. The value of that variable is whatever follows that pattern until we see 2% signs by themselves. And these tag markers, the start and end tag markers do need to be the first thing on a new line. And everything inside of those ends up being put into the variable named here inside of the tags object. So it's a way that you can have multiple variables that are populated inside your PowerShell or SSH command. And then you can tag those variables before sending it back to ServiceNow. So that way you don't have to parse the output of your command inside of a sensor script. We can do that parsing for you. So it's a good example of if you're provisioning something on a machine and you're going to use the next available port on that machine in a certain port range. This is a way that you can send back the path that you provisioned something on, the port that you provisioned something on. You can even send back success or failure. You can even send back an error message. And you can send those things back all in separate variables, so that when you get to parsing the output and doing your processing after the activity completes, everything's already separated for you. The same concept for SSH would work if you just did an echo. Same pattern and the same thing, the same result. So taking a step back, the artist ID needs to go here. And how do I get that artist ID? Well, that artist ID is an input to my new activity. And so how do I reference this input? Well, you can drag and drop. So I drag the artist ID input name. Notice one thing, I did already highlight what I want to replace. So because it's highlighted, when I drop it, it gets replaced. And it's a similar syntax to what you've seen before. $curly brace is a string substitution syntax that you'll see all over the ServiceNow platform and a lot in workflow. Typically in the past, this may have had workflow.scratchpad or workflow.inputs. In this case, it's actually referencing the activity input object and the artist ID property. And the same thing goes here. Now you can highlight it and it'll get replaced. But if you don't have anything highlighted, you'll see my cursor is flashing here. It's just going to write it wherever my cursor is. And that should do it. One other thing that I'll mention that's specific to PowerShell is the write host command. The way that the mid server executes PowerShell, if you don't use the write host command to send the output of your command to the parent process, which is the mid server that's launching PowerShell, then by default, PowerShell has, I believe, an 80 character column width. So without using the write host command, it actually goes through that PowerShell console and it puts a new line at every 80 characters. So if either this JSON object, well, it's a JSON string when it comes back to the mid server, but if the JSON or the XML is wider than 80 characters, has any lines that have more than 80 characters, it's going to put these new lines in there. And that's going to make it difficult to parse this XML when there's new lines everywhere. So by piping to write host, it allows us to bypass the PowerShell 80 character console width and send the output directly to the host process, which is the mid server. And so this artist XML, that's an XML object in PowerShell. Inner XML, that's really just the XML string. And then to pipe to write host, it says skip that new line at every 80 characters. Talk tracks JSON, that's again a PowerShell JSON object, and I'm using the convert to JSON commandlet, and I'm giving it a depth of 20. I don't think there's a depth of 20, but this ensures that it's going to convert not just the top level JSON properties, but even nested JSON objects and JSON arrays inside of this top tracks JSON variable. It'll go through all of them and convert all of them to a JSON string. And again, I'm piping to write host so that I skip those new lines. Now, that should do it for the command I want to run. And now let's look at the outputs. So, first thing I'm going to do, just to see the outputs, is I'm going to create an output called XML. And I'm going to create an output called JSON, just to see that these work. And then in a moment, we'll take a closer look at what's going on. So to populate these output variables, we drag the output variable into the parsing rule table. And you'll see this dialog pop up. Now, these sources, the execution result object, is specific to the template you're running. If this was REST, you'd see body and headers and error code or HTTP code. Because this is PowerShell, H result, that's a Windows-specific error code. Tags, that's the object that has all the outputs that we tagged in our command. When you select tags, it asks you which property from tags you want. So I have one tag called artist.xml, and I'm going to map tags.artist.xml to activity output.xml, and I'm going to do that directly. We're not going to do any parsing this time because we're just doing a test run to see exactly what this looks like. And now I'm going to do the same for JSON. And I have a tag here called top tracks JSON. And I'm going to directly populate my output called JSON from tags top tracks JSON. Now, one other that I'll be adding that we will keep is error messages. I'll use this activity output to tell us if the activity succeeded or failed. And this is going to come directly from the template's error messages. So if there's any errors, error messages will be populated. We'll use this inside of our condition. So the next step is to define default conditions. So the success condition is based on if there is an empty error messages. So gs.nil, that's a glide system call to say if this is nil. And I'll come back to my outputs tab and I'll copy activity output.error messages and I'll put it inside of gs.nil. So if there's no error messages, activity result should be success. I'd like to have that be the first one. And then failure is a simple condition, an else condition, meaning if all of the other conditions are not true, this one is, and that shows up at 200. I'll put this in my Spotify category so that it shows up inside my Spotify category on the right, and I'll submit the activity. So let's come back to our workflow and let's drop this activity in. You'll notice as I change tabs in the workflow IDE on the left, on the right side, things refresh. Each of the tabs on the right is relevant only to the tab you have active on the left. So this new activity we just created, get top tracks for artist, I'm just going to drag it into the canvas over the line till it turns blue. And it's going to ask me for artist ID. Just like we talked about, that's the input that I defined in the custom activity. And where do I get this artist ID from? Well, this is where the databus comes into play. This data tab knows all the activities that I already have in my workflow. I have one activity already in my workflow called get artist ID. I want the ID. That's the output of that activity. And I drag and drop. This is the syntax for the databus that is populated for you. And it basically says get the ID output from that activity and replace it into this input to this activity. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that because it doesn't come into play yet. And I'm going to run this workflow. And let's see, rolling start. So it's now testing this activity that we just created. I've already ran that first activity. This is a quick rest activity. When you hover over the activity, you can see the databus output. So we got the ID, which is that complicated string there. And that ID should be the input for this activity. Now let me refresh the page a couple times, let it finish. All right, it followed success, which means there was no error messages. And if I hover over this, I get to see the databus output from this activity. Now you'll see the JSON output is a big string of JSON. And if I were able to scroll down, you'd see XML as an XML string. I've already collected that JSON and XML. So now let's go back to the activity. and let's change our outputs. Now that we know that the tags.artist XML and the tags.topTracks.json is valid, we can get rid of these. And now we can create a new output. And this, let's call this top tracks message. All right. Now, I'm going to touch on a couple things here. First, we have a pre-processing tab, and we have a post-processing tab. This is a more advanced feature that can be used if dragging and dropping from your inputs into the command is not sufficient enough for a complex use case. What you can do is use pre-processing to provide the execution templates inputs with their values. Let's say you needed to take in a sys-ID or the name of a user as your activity input, and then you want to go look up that user in the user table, pull some values, maybe find the manager record, pull some values, look at a department, and if you want to use those values in your PowerShell command or your REST call or SSH, whatever the case might be, you can do that here in pre-processing. Similarly, post-processing is an opportunity to use script to populate your activities outputs using your execution results. Maybe the JSON or XML parsing is not enough. Maybe you want to combine multiple things from the output into one output. You can use post-processing for that. So we are going to use a post-processing script because, as you saw, that JSON array of tracks is complicated. And we don't want the whole JSON array of tracks. We just want a little bit of relevant information. So what we're going to do first, though, is we're going to use the artist name to pull the name of the artist out. Although we do have that artist name as a workflow input, I wanted to show how XML parsing works. And so we're going to parse that tags.artist.xml to get that. And we're also going to touch on this concept of a local variable. The local variable never leaves the activity. The local variable is not available to the workflow author, but it is available inside your activity, inside your post-processing. And I did see a question come in on the community, which was about, can the post-processing, can the parsing rules consume the local variables? And the answer to that is yes. So we'll come back to a local variable, and we'll call this artist name. Now, we don't want the artist name to be an output to our activity, but we do need the artist name inside of the post-processing script. So I'm going to create a local variable called artist name, and I'm going to bring it in from tags.artist.xml. And now the parsing type is XML. So this is showing you how to use the different parsing types. You'll notice when you change it from direct to actual, something that parses the output, it prompts you for more fields. Since I've already collected what that artist XML looks like, I have that, and I'm going to paste it in here. So it's asking you here for the sample payload data. So what does a sample of this tags.artist.xml look like? Well, that's the run I got yesterday. I was querying for Metallica. And so once you've pasted in the sample payload, it has to be a valid XML, JSON, if it's JSON. This is valid XML. So when I click parse, it actually turns this field into a clickable state. So by clicking what I want, Metallica, what I really am asking for is the name of the artist. It generates the XPath expression for me, /artist/name. That's the XPath expression that when run against this structure of an XML document will get you the value here of Metallica. Now that I have an expression, I can test it, and I can see that I got exactly what I wanted. So I'm going to save this. I now have a local variable called artist name that can be used inside of the post-processing script. But also, to answer the previous question, it can be used in subsequent activity, in subsequent parsing rules. So just to show an example of that, let's say I was going to use a parsing rule to populate this output. You'll notice I now have artist name available to me inside of this parsing rule. Now, that's not what we want to do. We're actually going to populate top tracks message using a post-processing script. It should be noted that these parsing rules run in order. So if I open up the error messages, I can't use artist name as a source because that local variable is not defined until this row. Now let's go to the post-processing script. Again, I did prepare this yesterday, so I will paste that in. But the concept here is that I have a JSON string, and I need to turn that into a JSON object. There's an array of tracks inside that object. And then I'm going to build up a message. And then I'm going to iterate through this track array and add to that message the information that's relevant. So for each track in the track array, I pull out the album, the name of the track, and its popularity according to Spotify. And then I append that to this message that I'm building. And then at the end, I assign the message that I've created to activity output top track message. Now, these angle braces are my notes for where I need to substitute. So inside of the post-processing and the pre-processing script, just like before, I can highlight. This needs to be execution result, tags, top tracks JSON. Now, because we don't know what's going to be inside your tags, we can't type everything for you, but you can see that according to the icon, this is an object. And because it's a script field, you click it, you don't drag it. So execution result dot tags dot top tracks JSON. Now that's going to be the JSON string that I need to parse. Now here, activity local dot artist name, I want to be there. And if I highlight activity output dot top tracks message, so now I'm going to be using the local variable that I created using that parsing rule that parsed the XML to extract the name of the artist. I'm going to be using that to start my message. I'm going to loop through all of the tracks in that JSON array, and I'm going to append to that message. And then I'm going to assign that message to my tops track message output. Now let's come back to this workflow here. And this log message now comes into play. So I'm going to delete that success path, and I'm going to connect it into this log message activity. Now I'm going to come back to get top tracks. The output here has changed because I just saved that custom activity. And my log message needs to come from that activity. I want to log the output of that activity in the workflow. So if I run this again, with Garth Brooks. And again, it's already generated the ID with the quick rest call, and then let's let PowerShell do the rest of the work. I do see a couple questions have come in. I'll answer those questions in just a moment. Now, you can see here the output does have some tracks, but if I come to the workflow context, and take a look at this most recent one, in my log, I can now see that log message. Top 10 tracks for artist Garth Brooks. The #1 most popular track, I Don't Need Your Rockin' Chair, on this album with this popularity. It looks like there was only 7 tracks that made the top list for Garth Brooks. But if we take a look back, you can see I've ran this a few other times. It looks like I did Beastie Boys here. Here's the top 10 tracks for Beastie Boys. And now you can see that demo and this example coming through. So now let me get to the questions. I had one question about, can you explain some of the other templates and the difference between a run script and a JavaScript? So let's go through all of them. SOAP and REST should be fairly straightforward. Those are web service-based activities. They leverage the REST message and the SOAP message table that already exists in the platform. PowerShell and SSH, also things we've had for a while, just using PowerShell for Windows-based orchestration and SSH for Linux-based orchestration. Probe, this actually is a very generic template that allows you to run any probe that's defined in the system. So in the past, building custom activities allowed people, there's a JDBC probe out there. There's a command probe that Alex blogged about on the community. There's a number of different probes, maybe SNMP, other probes that are part of the system that the mid server knows how to execute that we don't have a template here for. Probe is very generic. It allows you to say, run this probe with these probe parameters. We don't do any magic processing on the back end because we don't know what the output's going to be. We really just give you the ECCQ payload back. It allows you to do all those custom things that you could have done previously in the older activity definitions. Now, run script, this is similar to the run script utility activity. It actually doesn't run any mid-server probes. It's just a simple, it's a leaned down activity designer interface. There's no pre and post processing. In fact, I'll just show you one here. It's a very simple example. If I have an input called first name and I have an input called last name, I have an output called full name. The script would look like this. Output full name equals input first name space last name. Just a simple thing that allows you to run some scripts inside of a custom activity, so you kind of abstract the complexity of the script away from the workflow author, but enable them to do what that script does. And lastly, the JavaScript probe. This is running the JavaScript probe through the mid server. JavaScript is allowing you to call JavaScript on the mid server. Mid server script includes. There's a number of activities such as VMware that leverage that, and so this is allowing you to do that in the same way that you could with legacy activities. So again, JavaScript probe is JavaScript on the mid server using mid server script includes or custom JavaScript, and run script is just a simple run JavaScript in the instance, just like the old run script activity, only it's a new activity with inputs and outputs, and those outputs then are available on the databus. I think we had one other question here. Can older activities use the databus? And that's a really good question. We didn't want the new databus to not be something that the old activities can use. So the answer to that is yes. In fact, we saw an example of that. This log message, this isn't a new custom activity built with the databus, or sorry, this is not a new custom activity built with the activity designer, but it was able to access the databus. Now the older activities, their outputs are not structured and well-defined, so the outputs of these older activities are not available on the databus. But these older activities can consume the outputs of the newer custom activities whose outputs are available on the databus. So really any other of these core activities that you may already have for example, Active Directory, we still have these older activities, and you can think, hey, I already have this activity to change things, so can they use the databus? Yes. You can still go into the data tab and use any of the outputs from previous custom activities as inputs to these activities. And vice versa. If, let's say this was a scratchpad variable, you can use scratchpad here intermixed with the databus reference. And also for a new activity, let's say, for example, this ID is not coming from the databus. It can access the scratchpad in its inputs. In fact, here, this is accessing workflow inputs. This is a new REST-based get artist ID, accessing the workflow inputs as a drag and drop, or if you wanted to and you had it on the scratchpad, you could do artist name here. So they're all interchangeable. And that, I think, covers the questions that I saw. Let me check one more time for any new ones. Looks like all the questions. And yeah, that covers the demo I have for today. If anybody else has questions that you post later, we'll be keeping an eye on that community page, and we'll get the questions answered on there. Once again, thanks to everybody for coming to this Ask the Expert session and learning about orchestration.